The Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is set to reach Ahmadabad on a two-day visit. The visit is part of the 12th India-Japan annual dialogue, but Prime Minister Modi and Shinzo Abe would also launch the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor and also lay the foundation for India's first bullet train. The two leaders have met 10 times in the last 3 years. This will be Modi-Abe's fourth annual meeting since 2014. Soon after arriving, Modi and Abe will set out on a 9-kilometer road show to Mahatma Gandhi's Sabarmati ashram. Along the way, children from local schools will sing and dance on 28 stages to highlight India's myriad culture. Then, later in the evening, the two leaders will visit a 16th century mosque where the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, will personally explain the rich heritage and architecture to Shinzo Abe.
Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's engagements here in Ahmadabad will be a study in contrast with that of President Xi Jinping of China. President Xi visited Ahmadabad in the year 2014, but since then, in the last 3 odd years, India-China relations have declined, most recently on account of the standoff on the Doklam Plateau. But in contrast, India-Japan relations have never looked bigger or better. And the expectation here in Ahmadabad is that towards the end of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's engagements here, India-Japan relations would have risen to a whole new level. Ramesh Ramachandran, WION, Ahmadabad.
Tomorrow, the two world leaders will hold bilateral talks and officially lay the foundation for India's first bullet train, which will run from Mumbai to Ahmedabad. The 500 kilometers project is also known as the Mumbai-Ahmedabad High-Speed Railway Corridor, which is financed majorly by Japan. The train will run at a speed of 250 kilometers per hour and reduce travel time from current 7 hours to about 2 hours. India's first bullet train project is estimated to cost 1,11,000 crore rupees and is scheduled to be completed by 2023. Japan is giving a loan of rupees 88,000 crore and will charge a minimal interest of 0.1%. India has to repay the loan in 50 years.
I'm coming to you from near the venue of the groundbreaking ceremony here in Ahmedabad, in which Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan and Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India will participate tomorrow here in the city for the high-speed railway project that will link Ahmedabad with Mumbai in Maharashtra. Now, this high-speed railway project has been in the news for a whole lot of reasons, including on account of those who question the need for such an expensive infrastructure project. But the government of India, for its part, maintains that it will not put any additional burden on the existing financial resources, and that government of Japan is funding it at a minimal rate of interest of 0.1% for a repayment period of 50 years, and that...
And our correspondent Ramesh Ramachandran is currently in Ahmedabad tracking the visit of Japanese Prime Minister and joins us live. Ramesh, thank you very much for joining me. So many expectations before this meeting, isn't it?
Could you repeat that question, Daniele? I could not hear you properly.
Yes, no problem. I said there are very high expectations before this meeting, isn't it?
Yes, indeed, Daniele, there's an air of anticipation here in Ahmedabad this afternoon ahead of the arrival of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan. And if I can show you the mood here in Ahmedabad, the main square in the city, where crowds are thronging even as we speak in anticipation of the arrival of the dignitary. Mind you, this is the first time an entire bilateral visit will take place outside of the national capital, New Delhi. And that, to my mind, gives a new dimension to the execution of India's foreign policy, where states get as much importance as the national capital. So clearly, Ahmedabad is set to host Prime Minister Abe for the next 2 days, and the highlight of the visit will be tomorrow morning, when both Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi participate in the groundbreaking ceremony for the high-speed railway project here in Ahmedabad that will link this city with Mumbai in the adjoining state of Maharashtra.
What are the two leaders expected to meet upon? What are the main businesses they are going to talk about? Could you sum up for the benefit of our viewers? Ramesh, please.
Indeed, when the two principals meet, Daniele, both can be expected to discuss bilateral, regional and global issues of interest to both countries. But to my mind, the focus of the visit here will be security, defense cooperation, trade, investment and all-important infrastructure project in which Japan is funding the high-speed railway project up to 80% of the total cost of the project. So clearly a lot on the plate for Prime Ministers Abe and Modi. Remember, this is their 10th meeting in the last 3 years and the 4th annual summit that will be co-chaired by the two Prime Ministers. In all, we've seen 12 such annual summits take place between the two countries, and this summit will be particularly important, coming as it does in the wake of the standoff between India and China on the Doklam Plateau. And it's a study in contrast, really, Daniele, the way India-China relations have declined in recent months and the India-Japan relations have gone up. And the expectation here in Ahmedabad is that the bilateral ties will rise to a whole new level by the end of tomorrow evening when the visit concludes here in Ahmedabad.
Ramesh, thank you very much. I need to leave it there for the moment because the Prime Minister Narendra Modi is arriving right now in Ahmedabad, so we need to have a look at what is happening in the airport. Thank you very much, but do stay with us for more news. Okay, for the moment we're facing some difficulties. So Ramesh, are you still with me? If you can hear me, there is one more question I would like to ask you. When it comes to India and Japan meeting, one cannot avoid thinking about China. What will China say about these two, I would say, neighboring countries meeting?
Is that question to me, Daniele?
Yes, it's for you, Ramesh. Sorry, we're facing some difficulties.
Indeed, Daniele, China will be the proverbial elephant in the room when it comes to India-Japan relations. And most recently, as I said, the India-China relations were in the news for all the wrong reasons, especially in the wake of the standoff on the Doklam Plateau. But Prime Minister Abe's visit will be a study in contrast, really, with that of President Xi Jinping's visit to the same city in the year 2014. But India-China relations have declined, whereas India-Japan relations continue to grow from strength to strength. And that, to my mind, is the significance of Prime Minister Abe's ongoing visit to India here in Ahmedabad.
And Ramesh, can there be any space for a nuclear cooperation? Because India needs, I would say, desperately more and more technologies and more skills when it comes to developing nuclear projects. Is that something that the two prime ministers are going to talk about?
Absolutely, Daniele. We've seen the Japanese parliament recently in the month of July endorse the civil nuclear cooperation with India, and one can expect some forward movement on that count towards the end of Prime Minister Abe's visit here in Ahmedabad. Remember, many Japanese companies are interested in expanding or setting up their footprint, as it were, in India in the field of civil nuclear energy cooperation. And companies such as GE and Hitachi and Mitsubishi, Toshiba, all are interested in setting up their projects here in India in collaboration with American companies. So clearly, that is one big thing on the agenda insofar as civil nuclear cooperation goes. And also remember, Japan has pioneered or mastered the cycle of the closed fuel cycle, reprocessing of nuclear fuel, and India would be interested in, especially in the Rakosu nuclear plant operating in Tokyo, in Japan today, to collaborate in nuclear fuel reprocessing in the closed fuel cycle. So these are important items on the agenda. In addition to that, defense will be a key agenda item, especially the purchase of amphibious aircraft for the Indian Armed Forces, plus the fact that Japan is a key player in infrastructure development in India today.
So defense will be a major element in the talks. One more thing I would like to ask you. Could you please a little bit go through the history of the relations between India and Japan, if possible?
Absolutely, Daniele. We've seen India and Japan relations, take an upswing, as it were, towards the turn of the millennium. And since then, we've seen India and Japan conduct annual summits every year in each other's country. And remember, after Prime Minister Modi came to power in 2014, he visited Japan, especially started his visit with Kyoto. And similarly, today we are seeing Prime Minister Abe visit Ahmadabad, not New Delhi, the national capital, for his annual summit. And since then, India-Japan relations have grown in all spheres of human endeavor, be it defense, security, infrastructure development, especially in the area of high-speed railway. We've seen Japan collaborate with India in setting up the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor. So a whole lot of things are happening on the Indo-Japan front, especially, remember, in the light of the Asia-Africa growth corridor, which both countries are interested in, which is seen as a counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative. So a lot of agenda items for both Prime Ministers to deliberate upon over the next 2 days here in Ahmedabad. Daniele.
Okay, thanks for the moment, but stay with me, Ramesh. We definitely need your expertise on this matter for the next story, because the India-Japan handshake worries China. But for the record, Beijing is welcoming the infrastructure cooperation between the two countries.
中方乐见地区国家间开展包括铁路在内的基础设施项目的合作。我们也愿意与包括印度在内的地区国家共同推进各领域的交流合作，助力地区的经济发展。至于你关心的中印之间的铁路合作，我可以告诉你的是，铁路合作是中印务实合作的重要内容。铁路合作达成过重要的共识。据我了解，目前两国的有关部门就推进高速铁路既有线路提速等方面的合作保持着沟通。
These are live visuals that you're right now watching on your screens about the preparation to welcome the arrival of the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who will soon reach Ahmadabad in Gujarat, the western state of Gujarat, one of the most business-oriented state of India, and for that matter, perhaps for the entire subcontinent. The Prime Minister, the Japanese Prime Minister, will be on a 2-day visit in India. There is a lot on the table to discuss with the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who obviously will personally go and welcome him. They will first take part in a 9 kilometers road show, and it will end at the ashram, the historic ashram of the Mahatma Gandhi, the father of the Indian nation. This will pay honor and tribute to the memory of the father of Indian nation. But as I said, there is a lot to talk, there is a lot on the table between two nations, two countries that have been regularly meeting, and especially under Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This is the fourth annual meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Shinzo Abe. The levels of cooperation have gone very high. One of perhaps the pillar of this cooperation will be defense. India is interested in buying amphibious technologies and military military supplies from Japan. I am told that Ramesh Ramachandra, our correspondent, who's currently in Ahmedabad, is still with me. There is one more question that I would like to ask you, Ramesh. You said that this kind of diplomacy brings the Indian states on the stage, not only the nation. And Gujarat perhaps is a peculiar state. Am I wrong?
Well, Daniele, as I said before, Prime Minister Abe's visit to Ahmedabad is significant to the extent that this is the first time an entire bilateral visit will take place outside of the national capital, New Delhi. Remember, that said, President Xi Jinping of China did visit Ahmedabad 3 years ago in the year 2014, but at that time he did visit New Delhi. So this it will be the first time any foreign dignitary will be spending all his time outside of New Delhi. Now, that said, the fact that this meeting, this summit is taking place here in Ahmedabad is important in the sense that the importance of states in India shaping India's foreign policy is acquiring a salience of its own. That said, Japan is already a key player as far as investment goes in Gujarat, with all the private sector companies in automobiles, in infrastructure. Remember, the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor also passes through parts of Gujarat. So clearly, a lot of Japanese investments already being seen in Gujarat and outside of Gujarat as well. So Gujarat, to my mind, is a smart move on the part of New Delhi to host Prime Minister Abe for the annual summit here in Ahmedabad today.
And also is a state where the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, is definitely not seen as a, let's say, foreigner, for lack of a better word. Am I wrong?
Well, it adds to Prime Minister Modi's engagement in a sense. This is his home state. He was Chief Minister of Gujarat for many years. And to my mind, this is a homecoming of sorts for Prime Minister Modi, who many believe was taken away from their midst to the national capital to play a more important role on the national and international stage. So clearly, the excitement is clear there for all to see. People are thronging the square here behind me in anticipation of Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe, who will, by the way, travel in the road behind me all the way from the airport to the Sabarmati Ashram, made famous by Mahatma Gandhi, father of the Indian nation. And Prime Minister Abe will have two engagements today. One, visit to the Sabarmati Ashram, followed by a visit to the 16th century mosque called the Sayyid Ki Jali Mosque here in Ahmedabad. And those are the two engagements which he will participate in today. And tomorrow will be the operative part of his visit, which will see him participate in the groundbreaking ceremony for the high-speed railway project. But that said, all along the 8-kilometer route behind me, Daniele, there are at least 18 places, locations where school children dressed in traditional attire will perform cultural dances and functions in honor of the Japanese dignitary, and that, to my mind, adds a local flavor, a color to the whole engagement and event here, which begins in a short while from now.
And Ramesh, is it possible to ask the video journalist who's with you to get our viewer to see the road as at least as a perspective on which the Prime Ministers will travel?
Absolutely. If I can ask my video journalist to pan the camera for the benefit of our viewers who might just be tuning in. What you're seeing now are live visuals from a main square in Ahmedabad city. And the road in front of you will be the road which will lead from the airport to the Sabarmati Ashram. And all along the 8-kilometer route, there are flags of both India and Japan. There are banners, posters, buntings, all in honor of the visiting Japanese dignitary. And all on both sides of the road, you can see a posse of security personnel and commoners all thronging to catch a glimpse of the two leaders, Prime Ministers Abe and Modi. And here at the square behind me, you can see a lot of people, a lot of office goers have taken time out to come here and see the two leaders move past them to the Sabarmati Ashram. So clearly, as I said before, Daniel, a clear sense of anticipation here in Ahmedabad this afternoon ahead of Prime Minister Abe's visit here for the two-day annual summit between India and Japan.
And Ramesh, for the benefit of our international viewers, could you explain us a little bit what kind of state is Gujarat? I mean, where it drives the economy from? Because Gujaratis are very well known to be very business-oriented people, if I'm not wrong. So if you could spend a couple of minutes in explaining us what kind of state is Gujarat.
Well, Daniele, I can very simply quote Prime Minister Narendra Modi to give you a flavor, give you a sense of what the state of Gujarat is all about. And quote Prime Minister Modi, he said this many times before, that commerce runs in his veins. So that should give you a picture of what Gujarat is all about. Here people are industrious, laborious, they're entrepreneurial in their mindset and outlook, and that is manifested itself in the way Gujarat has grown in recent times. And Gujarat, by the way, is home to many automobile manufacturers. Gujarat and the southern state of Tamil Nadu are two states from where automobile plant manufacturers do set up their shops. So clearly a lot at stake for Japanese investors also here in Gujarat, where they have already invested a lot of money and time over the last several decades, including in automobile manufacturing and other hardware industries. So clearly a lot at stake for the local people here in Gujarat from Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's visit here for the annual summit. And they are, as I said, as you can see behind me, all looking forward to hosting Prime Minister Abe here for the next 2 days.
And when it comes to people-to-people relation, Ramesh, I mean, what kind of community is the Japanese community in India? And what kind of community is the Indian community in Japan, if there is any, or if it has any relevance, demographically speaking?
Well, clearly, India-Japan relations, the bedrock of that is indeed people-to-people ties. We've seen a steady stream of tourists, students, investors and business persons traveling to each other's country, and of late, due to the liberalization of visa and ease of doing business, we've seen many Japanese tourists and investors flocking to the western Indian state of Gujarat, where I am at the moment in search of business opportunities. So clearly, Gujarat is in the crosshairs of the Japanese investors, and they've been eyeing this state for a long time to come as well, and also in the future. And that, to my mind, would be a key takeaway from the business person's perspective. Remember, tomorrow, towards the end of Prime Minister Abe's visit, there will be a business plenary where both leaders will address the chambers of commerce of both countries, India and Japan, and they'll be looking forward to a roadmap for investments over the next 10 odd years, especially in the area of Make in India, which, by the way, is a prime flagship enterprise, as it were, of Prime Minister Modi's government. He wants foreign investors to set up shop in India, manufacture in India, and add to the economic growth of the region as well as of the country. And just to give you a flavor, Daniel, very quickly, I don't know whether you can see them, but there are groups of people flocking to the square behind me, shouting slogans and carrying placards and banners, all in anticipation of the visit of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and Prime Minister Modi, who will receive him at the airport behind me and come all the way to go to the Sabarmati Ashram, which is towards my left.
To a certain extent, Ramesh, we can definitely say that Japan anticipated, very much anticipated the Make in India campaign, because their brands are actually producing cars in India since a long time, isn't it?
Sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Yes,
Daniel?
no problem, not at all. What I was saying is that to a certain extent we can say that Japan somehow anticipated the Make in India vision of the current Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, because Japan is actually building and producing cars on Indian soil since many years, isn't it?
Absolutely, Daniele. For many Indians, Maruti Suzuki was their first car they ever owned. And that should give you a flavor of the kind of cooperation that India and Japan have, especially in the area of private industry and car manufacturing. And if you ask any Indian, young Indian here, they will remember with fondness the first car that they owned, which came from the Maruti stable, which was set up, as I said, in collaboration with Suzuki of Japan. So clearly, there is a lot of India Connect insofar as Japan is concerned, a lot of goodwill and popularity among Indian investors and ordinary people alike. And that, to my mind, is the bedrock of the India-Japan relationship, unlike many others which India has with several countries, but they do not have the necessary ballast or the underpinning of people-to-people ties and good country relationships, which is manifests itself in India-Japan, as I spoke before.
It seems there is hardly any negative aspect between these sort of relation. And talking about the sort of country that Japan is, at the end of the day, an island nation which gives to its maritime identity a very prominent role. So what kind of areas of cooperation when it comes to the Indian Ocean, I am thinking about, is possible between India and Japan?
Absolutely, without doubt, Daniele. The Indo-Pacific region will be a key area of discussion between Prime Ministers Abe and Modi here in Ahmadabad over the next 2 days. Remember, Japan and India are heavily invested in protecting sea lanes of communication extending all the way from Indian Ocean to the Sea of Japan, which borders Japan. So clearly, a lot at stake for both India and Japan, especially in light of China's so-called peaceful rise, which has pushed neighbors away from it, especially in light of the South China Sea dispute between China and some of its neighbors, especially the Philippines, Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, and so on. So clearly, the Indo-Pacific security architecture will be a key point of discussion between Prime Ministers Abe and Modi. Remember, India and Japan, in collaboration with the United States, are key members of the Malabar naval exercise, which concluded recently this year in India. And that, to my mind, is symbolic of the kind of cooperation which India and Japan enjoy. And they're looking forward to cement the strategic cooperation going forward as well. And that, to my mind, will be the defense and security cooperation will be the key areas of discussion here over the next 2 days.
And even if this meeting is mostly about the relation between India and Japan, I can imagine that there will be talks about the international situation, which is very much linked to the North Korean peninsula. What is the position of the two countries regarding North Korea in this difficult moment?
Absolutely, without doubt, Daniel. Again, both leaders can be expected to discuss regional issues of mutual concern. In Japan's case, North Korea is the obvious, the obvious issue that Prime Minister Abe will be discussing with Prime Minister Modi here in Ahmedabad. Remember, Prime Minister Abe has in the past spoken about his intention, at least, to travel to Pyongyang for opening a channel of communication. Remember, Japan does not have diplomatic ties with North Korea, and that, to my mind, is a significant offer made by Prime Minister Abe of wanting to travel to Pyongyang to discuss, to sort out the issue obtaining on the Korean peninsula and to de-escalate tensions currently obtaining there. And that, to my mind, will be a key point of discussion between India and Japan. India, for its part, Daniele, has consistently criticized North Korea on account of its proliferation activities. Remember, without naming Pakistan, India has consistently maintained that North Korean nuclear and strategic program has been in collaboration with Pakistan, and that, to my mind, will be, from India's perspective, equally important from its security point of view. So there might be a convergence of views on the issue of North Korea, at least in between India and Japan, when the two leaders meet here over the next 2 days.
These that you are currently watching on your television screens is the Prime Minister's airplane reaching right now. And we have to remember that the Japanese Prime Minister and the Indian Prime Minister will be together for 2 days in the western coastal state, the western Indian coastal state of Gujarat, which happens also to be the state of the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and a majorly business-driven state. So it's perhaps not a casual choice that the Prime Minister Narendra Modi decided to do when inviting the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to visit Gujarat. The two leaders will take a 9 kilometers drive, which will lead to the ashram made famous by the father of the Indian nation, Mahatma Gandhi. So this is to pay the honor to the memory of the father of the Indian nation, and then later in the evening they will visit a mosque where the Prime Minister, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, will personally explain the richness of the Indian architecture to its Japanese counterpart. So my colleague Aisha Sindhu is now joining me and is taking over. Over to you, Aisha.
Thanks very much, Daniele. Indeed, this is an important day for India. Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, will be in Ahmedabad. He's arriving shortly in the city, the capital city of Gujarat. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi, of course, going to be taking him around on a personal visit to many of the landmarks in the city of Ahmedabad, which also happens to be in the home state of the Indian Prime Minister. And there's a slew of cooperation agreements that are expected to be signed between India and Japan on this visit by the Japanese Prime Minister. It's a 2-day visit. To talk more about it with me, live on the broadcast is WION senior editor Surya Gangadharan. Surya, what's going to be, in your opinion, the most significant part of this visit beyond the optics?
I think it's taking place shortly after the Doklam face-off between India and China. So a clear signal there that, and incidentally, Japan was the only country to publicly voice its support for India during the standoff. So that's an interesting signal now being sent across to the Chinese again, that the India-Japan relationship is coming of age. It's acquiring a very pronounced strategic edge in that sense. and the two sides are more or less on the same page when it comes to dealing with a country like China, with whom both have border disputes. So that's a major signal going out from here. I think what's interesting also is the fact that both countries share common ideas, when it comes to India's Look East policy or China's or Japan's own policy towards the Pacific. So in that sense, a meeting of minds, and we're likely to see more of an India-Japan construct being shaped in the next 24 hours in Ahmadabad.
Right. Also, Surya, there's going to be the launching of the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor during this visit by the Japanese Prime Minister. And the obvious sort of comparison, if we're to look at it, would be with CPEC. And it seems like China always seems to be the elephant in the room when it comes to India's, outreach towards other Asian partners. What do you make of the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor project?
Well, I think it's a good balance in the sense that the African countries themselves have come forward and told India they would like India to balance off the Chinese presence in Africa. As you're aware, there are huge infrastructure projects that the Chinese have funded in Africa, and as is common with those kind of projects, they leave a lot of debt behind, which many African countries are unable to pay or find difficulty paying. In that sense, India's approach to development, which is basically focused on capacity building, small infrastructure projects, and a lot of scholarships to come and study in India, is affordable and also builds capacity within that country. So in that sense, India and Japan coming together for a growth corridor in Africa is something that African countries themselves have welcomed. And we need to see how this is going to be fleshed out. And of course, implementation is the key here.
Absolutely. Stay with me, Surya. Also joining me live on the broadcast from Ahmedabad itself is WION's correspondent, Ramesh Ramachandran. Ramesh, you were at the BRICS summit recently in Xiamen, and of course, despite it being a multilateral forum, there was this concentration on the India-China relationship, and I can't help but ask you to draw a parallel for us, considering the deterioration and the picking up, so to speak, of the pieces of that relationship now between India and China, and then we compare it to India and Japan. And this show of strength in many ways with the Japanese Prime Minister arriving today in India.
Absolutely, Aisha. This is a study in contrast, really. Prime Minister Modi's engagements with President Xi Jinping of China on the one hand, and Prime Minister Modi's engagements with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan on the other hand. And I will go back even 3 years back in history to talk about 2014 when President Xi Jinping visited Ahmedabad, this very city, by the way, when he first visited after Prime Minister Modi came to power. And then and now we've seen a marked change in India's relations with China, especially in the wake of the standoff on the Doklam Plateau. But that said, in contrast, Aisha, the India-Japan relations have never looked bigger or better to my mind. And the expectation, if you talk to a cross-section of people here in Ahmedabad today, is that by the end of Prime Minister Abe's visit here tomorrow, India-Japan relations would have risen to an entirely new level, and that's the expectation among diplomats who have travelled with Prime Minister Modi's team here to Ahmedabad, and also state government officials here in Ahmedabad who've been tracking Japanese investments over decades in the state of Gujarat.
Absolutely. Just to remind our viewers, the visuals on your screen right now are live visuals coming in from the city of Ahmedabad, where Shinzo Abe arrives with his wife on a 2-day visit to the state. He'll be, of course, welcomed by India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Surya, this is also an interesting time for Japan, given what's going on in the Korean Peninsula and Japanese apprehensions about, the nuclear program of North Korea, the ballistic test missiles and all of that. So keeping that in mind and India's position on the North Korea standoff, I suppose this is another way of looking at the strength of the Indo-Japanese relationship.
In fact, Japan and India are on the same page on North Korea. Both have supported sanctions. Both don't want the North to cease its missile testing and its nuclear weapons program. And India especially has perhaps understands this even more because North Korea, along with Pakistan and China, were part of that illegal black market that the Pakistani scientist A.Q. Khan was operating a few decades ago. And we're not even sure now, even today, it's not even clear how wide that black market is and what segments of it are still operating in which part of the world. So, as you're aware, the North is still involved in the supply of black market supply of missiles, missile components to various countries all over the world, including Libya and Syria and Iraq and Saudi Arabia. So, in that sense, there is a commonality between Japan and India too.
Right, but Surya, where exactly does Japan figure in terms of India's outreach to its neighbours, to the region, to Prime Minister Modi's Look East policy? How significant of a partnership is this between the two countries?
No, I think India and Japan are basically Japan sees India as the main driver in Southern Asia. And while they have diplomatic relations with most of the countries in Southern Asia, they also believe in the concept that every region must have an engine. And India is the engine, which is why they've invested so heavily in India. We have more than 1,000 Japanese companies presently in India, and are not even referring to Maruti or any of the others, you know. So you can imagine how wide the Japanese perception of the Indian market is and the way forward. The Japananises are aware that countries like Pakistan, maybe Nepal, Bhutan, these are all very, very small markets. Pakistan, of course, is heavily dominated by the Chinese, who may have no space to, who may be in no mood to allow Japanese entry into that market. So, in a sense, they'll be kept out of there. But the other markets on India's periphery, frankly, are very small. And in that sense, India provides the kind of economies of scale that they look forward to.
Right. Ramesh, if I can come to you next, you know, when Japan was, integral to the arrival of the Maruti Suzuki 800 way back when in India, and it became the ubiquitous form of transport for the Indian family back then, even though there were questions raised on how popular and how feasible the Maruti 800 will be for India. And now we're seeing the same sort of naysayers pop up about the bullet train project. So in some ways the relationship has come full circle with both the positives and the so to speak the negatives of that. Before you answer that question though, Ramesh, just want to remind our viewers, live visuals coming in from Ahmadabad, Prime Minister Narendra Modi making his way over to the plane to welcome Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan and his wife, who are in India now for a 2-day visit. Ramesh, over to you.
Indeed, Aisha, as you mentioned, India-Japan relations can be described as a synergy between India's soft power or software power and Japan's hardware or hard power in terms of manufacturing industry. So that has manifested itself in the early 80s in the manufacture of Maruti Suzuki cars here in India. And today we've seen the emphasis shift again under Prime Minister Modi to manufacture in India under his Make in India program.
Right.
And the expectation here in Ahmedabad at least is that on account of the high-speed railway project, there'll be a quantum jump in terms
All right.
of...
Ramesh, allow me to come in because, the hug has happened. Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe have just shared a very warm hug on arrival. He's now shaking hands, of course, with Prime Minister Abe's wife. Shinzo Abe being received by a number of delegates there in Ahmedabad. He and his wife, of course, here in India for a 2-day visit. Prime Minister Modi personally welcoming his Japanese counterpart to the country for this 2-day visit. It's replete with images that will perhaps keep us talking for the next couple of days for certain. This, remember, is part of the 12th India-Japan annual dialogue. And Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe will also be using the opportunity to launch the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor and lay the foundation for India's first bullet train, which will run between Ahmedabad and Mumbai. Prime Minister Modi, along with a number of senior delegates there in Ahmedabad, welcoming Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and his wife to India. Now, this is Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe's 4th annual meeting since the year 2014. Now, after the arrival, they will set out on a 9-kilometer roadshow to Mahatma Gandhi's Sabarmati Ashram. Along the way, children from local schools will be singing and dancing on 28 stages to highlight India's myriad cultures. And later on in the evening, of course, both Prime Ministers will visit a 16th century mosque where Prime Minister Modi will personally explain the rich heritage and architecture of the structure to Prime Minister Abiy. Prime Minister Abiy now receiving a guard of honor, in some ways a welcome to India. Remember, the Indian Prime Minister has broken with protocol by choosing to welcome Prime Minister Abiy at the airport itself. Visuals of from the city of Ahmadabad in the state of Gujarat, Prime Minister Modi's home state, where the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has just arrived with his wife for a 2-day visit. The Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, on hand to welcome his Japanese counterpart and his spouse to India. This visit, of course, part of the 12th India-Japan annual dialogue. But also on the agenda is the launch of the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, a strategic partnership, of course, considering China's moves in terms of infrastructure through the CPEC and the One Belt, One Road initiative. This being seen, of course, as a counterweight to China's hegemony in the region. They'll also be laying the foundation for India's first bullet train. The two leaders will be meeting for the 10th time in the last 3 years. And this will be the 4th annual meeting between the two since the year 2014. Let's go back to my colleague Ramesh Ramachandran, who's joining us live from Ahmedabad. He's taking us through the significance of this visit. Ramesh, it seems that every time there's a high-level meeting and you and I are talking, I can't help but bring up, the optics, the symbolism of this meeting between world leaders, and there's been a very warm hug that's taken place between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abiy. It's become almost part and parcel of the Prime Minister's overtures towards his counterparts from different parts of the world.
Very true, Aisha. Indeed, every time Prime Minister Modi travels abroad or he receives a foreign dignitary at home, there's always the talk about the proverbial hug, how deep it was, how friendly it was. But that said, on the subject of hugs, Aisha, one can't help but talk about the no hug that was on display between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi of China. To my mind, he is probably among the few world leaders who haven't yet received a hug from Prime Minister Modi. Even the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif, remember when Prime Minister Modi stopped over in Lahore on his way back home from Afghanistan a few years ago. They did meet cordially and interact with their families, but to my mind, the absence of that much talked about hug between the leaders of India and China should tell you something about the state of relations between those two countries. But coming back to the ongoing visit of Prime Minister Abe of Japan, we've seen some activity behind me of motorcade traveling from the airport to the Sabarmati Ashram. And this is one of those main squares behind me from where Prime Minister Modi and his entourage will arrive from the airport and turn left as we speak to reach the Sabarmati Ashram, made famous, as everybody knows, by Mahatma Gandhi, the father of the Indian nation. And that will be just two of his engagements today, this evening here in Ahmedabad. The Sabarmati Ashram, followed by a visit to the 16th century mosque, as you said before, Aisha. These are the two engagements of Prime Minister Abe today. But tomorrow will be the operative part of his visit and his talks here in Ahmedabad, especially the laying of the foundation stone for the high-speed railway corridor project with links Ahmedabad and Mumbai. But that's it to give you a flavor of the moment, as it were, as we wait for the entourage to arrive at this square behind me. If I can ask my video journalist to pan the camera and give you a flavor of the kind of people who have come out in large numbers from the offices and homes to catch a glimpse of the two leaders, Prime Ministers Abe and Modi. And as you can see, a thick posse of police personnel also present on either side of the main road leading from the airport all the way to the Sabarmati Ashram. This is a distance about 8 kilometers, and every half a kilometer or so there's a stage show being organized by school children attired in traditional clothes and performing traditional dances to give the Japanese leader a flavor of the culture and tradition of the Western Indian state of Gujarat, from where Prime Minister Modi himself belongs. So clearly a lot of India Connect and Gujarat Connect here on display for Prime Minister Abe.
Absolutely. In fact, the live visuals coming in from the airport also displaying the sort of events that have been planned alongside the ones that you mentioned. There are, of course, dancers who are performing for Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and his wife, who've just arrived in Ahmedabad. Prime Minister Abe's wife, Aki Abe, now receiving a sash from monks who have gathered there at the airport. The three of them now, Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Abe and his wife, making their way out of the airport. As my colleague Ramesh was pointing out for us, there are two main engagements today on this first day of Prime Minister Abe's visit. One, of course, to the Sabarmati Ashram, the other to a 16th century mosque in the city, which will take place later in the evening. The business end of things will begin tomorrow, where, of course, the foundation stone of the high-speed train connecting Mumbai and Ahmedabad is going to be laid by both prime ministers. Remember, Japan is heavily invested in that project. They have advanced a huge loan to India at a very minimal rate of interest, which will be payable by the year 2050, if I'm not mistaken. We'll check that date for you in just a bit. But visuals there on your screen of the prime ministers leaving the airport, from where they are going to be heading out very shortly. We'll be keeping track of that, of course, for you. My colleague Ramesh Ramachandran getting us live updates from Ahmedabad itself. WION senior editor Surya Gangadharan also with us on the broadcast. He's joining me live from the newsroom. Surya, I know you're hesitant talking about optics, but since I'm following up that question that I'd taken to Ramesh, I can't help but ask you. It is almost a way of figuring out relationships. I mean, social media is one thing, but then also interpersonal relations, body language. There's so much. There are studies done on it. There are college programs conducted on it. And I suppose Prime Minister Modi himself might become the subject of one of those theses somewhere in the world, because as Ramesh was mentioning, the cold vibes between India and China displayed quite significantly through the absence of that hug. And over here, the warmth on display just goes to show that the relationship between India and Japan goes beyond just bilateral ties, but a relationship between two individuals as well.
Well, I think at the end of the day, whether it's Prime Minister Abe or Prime Minister Modi, at the end of the day, they are batting for their own national interests, you know. And if a little hug here or a warmer handshake there or something helps along the way, why not, you know. But at the end of the day, both are batting for their respective countries. Japan is pushing for better ties with India at a time when it is facing issues, not only in terms of its economy, also in terms of China, and the fact that the security agreement with the US appears to be fraying. So they are also looking for allies, they're looking for insurance, they're looking for markets. If you look at India, we are concerned about the Chinese, yes. We are concerned about what they are doing on our western border with Pakistan. We are looking at insurance. We are looking at building ties with the US. Japan is another middle part, which has technology. It has money to be able to invest in India, to be able to give us the kind of technology we need to build up our own strength. So in that sense, it's a win-win situation for both. And both these represent national interests. So hugs and all that aside, at the end of the day, it's about national interests, period.
Absolutely. Live visuals are on your screen right now. For those of you who are just joining in, these are from Ahmadabad, where the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has just arrived. He's been welcomed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and the cavalcade has now departed from the airport. They'll be setting out on a 9-kilometer road show to Mahatma Gandhi's Sabarmati Ashram, and along the way, as my colleague Ramesh Ramachandran was pointing out for us, children from local schools are going to be singing and dancing, performing on 28 stages to highlight the diversity of India's culture, India's social fabric, all of that for the Japanese Prime Minister who is in India on a 2-day visit. Of course, later in the evening, the two leaders will also be visiting a 16th century mosque. The Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be personally on hand explaining the rich heritage and architecture of the structure to Prime Minister Abe. But as much as this is about symbolism and optics, Surya Gangadharan, my colleague, pointing out to us that at the end of the day, it's also about both countries doing what they need to for the interests of their respective nations. Japan, of course, caught in the crosshairs of that ongoing war between, of words at least, between North Korea and the United States. Japan, of course, pushing for more sanctions against North Korea. This perhaps a welcome distraction from all that's going on in the Korean Peninsula. Meanwhile, India too is looking to solidify its relationship with some of the key Asian countries, Japan, of course, included on that list. This is very much a part of Prime Minister Modi's Look East initiative, his Neighbourhood First initiative as well. And of course, coming on the back of what's just gone down between India and China, or as far as the Doklam standoff goes, the solidifying of this relationship between India and Japan gaining more significance, undoubtedly. The streets of Ahmedabad, empty as they are, but the sidelines, of course, packed with spectators, packed with performers from local schools who are waiting to give Prime Minister Abe and his wife a taste of Gujarati culture and, of course, larger ideas of India's culture. There's going to be 28 stages on which children from local schools are going to be performing for the dignitaries who've just arrived in India, to give them a taste of India's myriad cultures and India's rich heritage, of course. Let's go back to my colleague Ramesh Ramachandran, who's live with us on the broadcast from Ahmedabad. Ramesh, paint a picture for us. The streets, of course, completely devoid of cars at this point in time, but this has generated a great degree of excitement in the city, I'm sure.
Absolutely, there's no denying that, Aisha. The mood here, if I can to diligently convey to viewers of WION at the moment as we speak, is one of anticipation and excitement. People, men, women, children from all walks of life have gathered at this square behind me to catch a glimpse of the two leaders, Prime Ministers Abe and Modi, as they make their way from the airport, the road behind me, and turn left from the square to the Sabarmati Ashram, made famous by none other than Mahatma Gandhi, the father of the Indian nation. And that will be his first official engagement here in Ahmedabad at the beginning of his 2-day visit for the 12th annual summit between India and Japan. But that said, as I mentioned, there are lots of people still walking as I speak to you, men, women and children making the way in queues, in line to the nearest square behind me to catch a glimpse of the two leaders as they make their way from the airport to the Sabarmati Ashram. And there are lots of posters and buntings, banners of both leaders, including the wife of the Japanese Prime Minister, all three on the banners and posters here at the square, and also the Japanese and Indian flags, and lots of stage shows being held behind me to honor the visiting dignitary by way of cultural performances, music and dance. So clearly, all in all, a festive mood here in Ahmedabad this afternoon as this square behind me waits in anticipation for the arrival of the motorcade that will take both leaders from the airport to the Sabarmati Ashram.
Right, the two choices though, Ramesh, of Sabarmati Ashram and the mosque. The ashram, of course, an obvious one considering the connection with India's, the father of the Indian nation, Mahatma Gandhi. What's the significance of this 16th century mosque? Is there something special that, is the reason why it's been chosen as one of the only two cultural engagements for the visiting Prime Minister on the first day of his visit?
Not really, Aisha. Any visitor to Ahmedabad, I'm told, does indeed visit the Sabarmati Ashram and the Siddhi Said Ki Jali, the 16th century mosque here in Ahmedabad. Those are the two must-see, must-do spots or locations, as it were, for any casual visitor to Ahmedabad. And that, to my mind, will also be the reason why Prime Minister Modi wants his Japanese counterpart to visit these two areas. But that said, we've seen both Indian and Japanese leaders travel to each other's country on more occasions in the recent past, and also make it a point to travel outside of their respective national capitals. Remember, when Prime Minister Modi visited Japan a few years ago, he began his visit and went to Kyoto, which is a town outside of Tokyo. And similarly, we've seen Prime Minister Abe, when he last visited India, travel to Varanasi and where he performed an evening arti on the banks of the river Ganges in Varanasi, which, by the way, is the parliamentary constituency of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So clearly, a lot of cultural affinity at display here in Ahmedabad, also given the pacifist constitution that Japan has stood by for many decades now. And that, to my mind, the principle of non-violence espoused by Mahatma Gandhi also is weaved into the atmospherics or the optics of Prime Minister Abe's visit here this afternoon.